Hello, I'm Conor McReynolds, and welcome to another episode of The Dinner Party. Each week, I interview a fantastic guest to learn all about their dream dinner party. I want to know who they would invite, where they would host their party, and what they would cook for their guests. This week, I'm chatting to someone who I've known personally and admired professionally for over 25 years, theatre writer and composer Paul Boyd. Paul has written over 20 stage musicals and his work has toured all over the world. He's written for families and adults, he's written traditional stage performances, and even water based shows. He's creative, he's hilarious, and he's absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear all about Paul's dream dinner party. So without further ado, here is the brilliant Paul Boyd. Paul Boyd, hello. How are you?
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
We're good. Everything is good. The sun is shining. I don't know when people will be listening to this, but it's about 200 degrees in London today. So
Yes.
I'm very glad this isn't a video blog of any kind.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm quite frankly disgraceful today. I'm sort of sat here in a very old grubby t-shirt and fan on me, and there's no way of looking good in this heat.
No, there's not. There's not. But let's paint a picture that we're sitting in dinner jackets by a roaring fire, having a gentlemanly chat.
Absolutely, a glass of scotch in one hand.
Yes.
Well, Paul, how? What have you been doing in this lovely weather? Have you been sat out in your beautiful garden, or?
I have. I've been spending some, not today, actually, today has been too hot for that. But I
Uh-huh.
have, during all of this sort of crazy period of time, I have become my own grandfather and I have been pottering around the garden in a straw hat. I just sort of a mix between my grandfather and Miss Marple. Some, with
That's a
a sort of
fantastic mix.
a basket of lavender over one arm as I collect it. No, it's been actually has been a godsend. Gardening is one of those things that I think once you get into it, you realize that it's a bit addictive because you plant something, you see it grow.
Hmm.
And as writers, we're used to doing all of that, right? Theatre people, creative people, we do that. But sometimes it's up to other people whether those things flourish and bloom and blossom. When you have a garden, it's all up to you. So actually, gardening is for control freaks. You're only battling the weather, and nobody can blame you for that.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I think you would be so upset if you saw my garden. It's kind of in between two gardens where they're very clearly very proud of their gardens, and then there's sort of Jurassic Park in the middle of it. It's
So
really
you're kind of
disgraceful.
yours is lying fallow, I believe, is how we describe that.
Oh yeah. I think it would be what my parents would say is a stain on the family name. I
Yes,
think they'd be
staying on
deeply
the
ashamed
family
of me.
escutcheon. Yeah,
Well, Paul, you've written. Am I right in saying 24 musicals in a
20.
career that's?
Yeah, 20. Yes, no, you're right. 24. I'm actually writing 25 now, but number 25.
Oh wow.
As to whether that's happening or not, who knows? But I'm still doing the writing of it
Well,
either
would
way.
we
So
say at this point kind of 24 and a half or 24 and
uh,
three quarters? Are we being optimistic or?
let's say 24 on a page, because although I'm writing, I'm not going about it with any gusto.
It's difficult when you haven't got I guess, a definite time frame to work in. Is that something that helps you write the sort of the
Yes,
looming
definitely.
deadline?
Deadline. I love that Douglas Adams quote. I probably
Oh
will
yeah, yeah.
misquote it now, but I love a deadline. I love the sound as it whooshes past.
Yeah.
That is very much me. I've been very lucky throughout my career to always be writing something that is already scheduled for production. Most, if not all, of what I've done over the years has been commissioned work. I know that some
Yeah.
people take great joy in writing and they write and they have drawers full of musicals or plays that they one day hope to see produced. And that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing, I've never been able to do that. I've always had to have the poster done first. I only ever seem to write a show, the poster for which is already on the wall somewhere. Um, and so, yeah, this is a bit challenging this year because although I am in denial and pretending that the show is opening later this year, that potentially is not going to be the case. We really don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm going to keep writing anyway. And the worry is that if it's postponed till next year, people will expect it to be twice as good because I'll have had twice as long to write it.
But I
So
think
we'll
the
have to wait
other
and
thing
see.
with that is audiences will be twice as happy to be back in theaters,
Yes,
that
and potentially
hopefully
you can put in
expectations are
you
offset
could
with their excitement.
you could potentially put in half the effort and get twice the applause. I mean, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
fantastic maths we could add to this. But let's hope that when these things are done, there is a tremendous round of applause for everyone, and we're all so happy to be back at work. The quality is going to be through the roof.
Oh, I think that's almost certainly the case. But over the 20 years, is it, that you've been writing musicals?
Yes, yes. I started when I was about 10, as you know. Yes, it has been. It has been about that long now. Yeah.
And do you find it easier as you've gone along, or does it become more and more challenging to sort of find ideas that excite you in the same way as they did earlier in your career?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. The first is that in a way it is more difficult because when you've done something and you've ticked a box, whether that is the style of the show or the title of the show or whatever, it's very difficult to get excited to go back and do that again. So if
Hmm.
someone came to me, for example, and said, oh, we need a musical adaptation of a Grimm's fairy tale. Well, my early career was all that, Grimm's
Yeah.
fairy tale stage adaptations. I'd find that difficult to do now unless I could find a quirky way of doing it or something interesting. So in a sense, it has become more difficult. On the
Yeah.
other hand, it is no more difficult than it has always been because you I only ever am interested in doing a show that is challenging. So what challenges me today isn't maybe what challenged me 20 years ago, but
Hmm.
the level of challenge is the same. And I think that's the difference between if somebody asks you to write a particular show and you have to decide, well, is that something I can bring something to? Does that challenge me in any way? And if not, then you've got to pass on it. There's no point in making your own life hell. Um,
Yeah.
Simply, creativity is all about challenge.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I was lucky enough to see what I think was your first ever musical, Macbeth the Musical,
Yes,
way back
you were a
when
tiny child then.
I was sat in the
Well, you were
rehearsal
never
room
you were
thinking that
never a
Macbeth
tiny
was just the
child, but you
funniest
were
thing ever.
yes, you were a
No.
very young child. Yes.
But do you still look back at that kind of early work that you did, sort of Macbeth the Musical and Who Framed Esmeralda and all those early shows of yours? Do you look back at them fondly still, or do you look back on it thinking, God, I wish I knew then what I know now?
Both, absolutely both. I mean, I have very fond memories of Macbeth the musical because it was a show I wrote when I was still a student, and it was the show that launched my career. And there are still some great numbers in there and some funny lines. My big dream is that I get that back on the road again. I started rewriting it a couple of years ago and got sort of I don't know, a quarter of the way through it before something else distracted me.
Mm.
Um, but it'll be 30 years old in 2 years' time. So
Oh,
there
well.
would be something wonderful about doing a concert of that, having
Oh,
reinvented it
absolutely.
somehow. And the other one you mentioned, Esmeralda, was something I got the chance a few years ago to sort of readdress.
Mm.
A theatre commissioned me to write a musical based on the same book, Hunchback, the Notre Dame de Paris. And I
Hmm.
kind of went, well, I've already written a version of that a long time ago, but I'd really like to do it properly this time. And so that musical, Hunchback, I don't know what year that was, 2013, maybe 14. Um, that was written with the old musical I'd written 20 years earlier at the back of my mind. And some of the tunes and things kind of still exist in the new version. But I think very fondly of the old shows, and I'd love to have the opportunity to brush them off and kind of put my current writing hat and writing style into them.
Oh,
Which obviously these things develop as you get older.
that would be incredibly exciting for me as well. I would love to see it back on stage and see if I remember kind of sitting in the rehearsal room watching it as a 5-year-old, insisting that I had to put on my sister's tartan skirt because I wanted to be just like Macbeth. That
You did,
was.
you did, you did. That was the first time I've seen, not the last, but certainly the first time I'd seen you in a skirt.
And Paul, I think one of your certainly most successful shows in terms of the reach it's had around the world is your musical version of Alice in
Hmm.
Wonderland. I
Hmm.
mean, it's been performed in the States and in Japan and all over the place. And you sent me the soundtrack as a kid, and I absolutely loved it. And I finally got to see it a couple of years ago at the beautiful Lyric Theatre in Belfast. And the music had evolved quite a bit. That sort of process that you talked about there with Macbeth and with Esmeralda and Hunchback, the music had evolved a bit and changed over the course of the 20-year life of this show. Is that a fun process?
Yes, nobody likes writing. Everyone likes rewriting. So
Hmm.
uh, Macbeth was the version you saw. It was its 20th anniversary, so I was restaging it for the Lyric in Belfast, where the show had originally started.
Hmm.
And there's no way something I wrote 20 years ago was just going to be slapped up on stage. I mean, any more than an essay that you might have written at school would be any good for publication. Now, you're always going to look at these things and change them and try and make them as good as possible. Because
Yeah.
also the thing is, in that 20-year period of the interim, audiences have changed. Audiences nowadays are very different in terms of their literacy and the kind of stories, particularly for young people and children, the kind of stories they listen to and are able to interpret is much more complicated than it was 20 years ago. I mean, I started writing pre Harry Potter, pre Twilight movies, pre Artemis Fowl books. All of these stories all have very complicated subplots and characters. And
Hmm.
children nowadays are used to digesting that. And therefore, you can't just give them a show that was written slightly lower focus 20 years ago. And so one of the
Mm.
joys of redoing Alice was thinking, right, so for the kids and the young people today, how can I make this show uh, better and use all the experience that I've had in the meantime to make an even more magical musical? Because of course 20 years ago was pre Matilda. These stage
Oh
musicals,
yeah.
Wicked.
Yeah.
There really were no stage musicals for children back then, other than those which were staged at the regional theatres. There's a whole language of musical theatre now for young people, which I hope the new Alice fits into.
Yeah. Oh well, certainly. I was there. The only time I could get in to see it was during a school production, so it was, or for kids coming in, and they loved it. But it was mad. I mean, I've taught schools workshops, but those kids were just going crazy, kind of doing the flossing with the white rabbit and all sorts. They were just going
Yeah,
mad for it.
yeah, they
Uh,
do. It was like a rock concert, which is
yeah, it
fantastic.
really is like that. And then on the other end of the kind of the spectrum of your work, you do such brilliant writing and theatre for adults as well. Um, is there a do you have a preference for kind of if you were cherry picking your projects? Do you love writing those things that families will remember for years to come, or do you kind of get to think free reign? I can say and do whatever I want with a show for adults.
As you say, I have done both. I mean, I don't really ever set out to write a show for any particular audience. I think that's always a danger when I'm teaching writing. The first thing I always say to people is, write the show for you. You've got to
Hmm.
write the show that you would go to see. So I'm aware that some of my shows are classed as family shows and some are classed as adult shows. They're both shows that I would go to see. As you say,
Yeah.
the difference is when you are aware that it's only for adults, then you can be a bit more kind of risque. I had a show called Molly Wobbly's Tit Factory,
Yeah.
which clearly wasn't for children. And but I was commissioned to write that, and I was commissioned to write that on the basis that it would be as adult a show as I was prepared to write.
I
And that
see.
there
Okay.
was freedom with that. There was tremendous, and I felt like all of the swearing that I'd not put into lyrics for the previous sort of 15 years all came out in that show. It was like 1 2 hour long expletive.
A kind of purge.
It
Get it
was a
all out in one
complete, yeah.
show.
And I haven't done another one since, but I feel it building up again. So perhaps there'll be a perhaps there'll be a sequel.
Brilliant. And I mentioned earlier about how your work's been on kind of all over the world. Have you ever made it out to see one of these performances somewhere like Japan or the
I
States
haven't.
or anything?
Well, Japan I didn't get to see, but they are just hot off the press that there is a production opening in Japan next March.
Oh, wow.
Of that new version of Alice, which listen, who knows what way the world will be next March, but I'd love to see it. I do get to see videos. I make them show me videos and photographs and things. The
Yeah.
Japanese one is great because it's just in a different language, obviously, but it's in one of those languages that bears no resemblance to ours. If you hear your own show done in French or German or Italian, you do kind of a general sense of what they're singing about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Japanese is such a foreign language. Excuse the obviousness of that.
Sure.
It's tremendous fun to listen to them try to wangle the way through the lyrics, and I don't know what they're singing about. It sounds fantastic. So who knows? I might see that one. I know there's another Alice in Canada next. I think that might be March or April as well.
Oh, wow.
So who knows? I have seen some when I lived in the States. There were productions of my shows in other areas of the States that I was able to travel to
Yeah.
to see. I saw a few Hansel and Gretels along the West Coast, which was kind of fun.
Oh, wow.
So I get to see them every now and again. I tell you, the weirdest thing was I got to sit in the auditions for one show of mine that was being done in Miami,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm not great with auditions anyway. I don't really like auditions. I think they're probably the least effective way to find cast that there is, but it's what we do. So I was watching all of these ladies, these actresses come in, these girls, and they were all singing. And at that point, everyone was singing "Part of Your World." You know that song from Little Mermaid, the
Yeah.
Disney song. So that was the audition song. And everyone that came in and sang it, it just happened to be very popular that year. There's always one song that's doing the rounds. But that year they were singing it. In the back of my head, I kept thinking, stop doing the American accent. Because in British auditions and Irish auditions, you do occasionally get an actress or an actor come in, and the song that they've learned it from a Broadway show or from an American movie, and they do the accent. And you're thinking, I don't want to hear you do the American accent. I want to hear you. And of course, in America, that is their accent. So it was very odd. I was actually biting my tongue to say, please, can you do it in your own accent? Then I realized, oh my God, that actually is their own accent. And it really sounds as hokey as when the Brits do it or the Irish do it. So I've seen a few. I've seen a few.
That's very funny. It's very, very strange. Well, speaking of kind of auditions and finding the cast for shows, you are adamant that you won't be acting again, that you won't be in any more stage productions. I got to see you in Cocoon at the Leicester Square Theatre a few years ago, the great Spike Milligan play. You said that you were sort of slightly duped by the director into kind of appearing in it, sort of by stealth.
Yes, that was
Why?
casting by stealth.
Why are you so adamant? Because you're such a
Well,
wonderful performer, but why
well, you're
is it
very
not something that
kind.
excites you?
Uh, as you know, back in the day when we all started out, we all did everything. So I would have written and composed and directed and acted in the shows.
Hmm.
And then at some point in your career, when people start asking you to do work, paid work, commissions, you realize that they're asking you to do one thing and not the other. So I was getting lots of approaches, people asking me to write music for their shows, to write scripts for their shows, to write musicals. Very few people asking me to act professionally. And so I followed the money. I just veered towards where the demand was. And
Yeah.
I'm a performer. I'm not an actor. I don't think I'd ever play Hamlet. I mean, I'm past that now, but I think even as a young actor, I was aware I'd never be Hamlet. So, what's the point? I guess if you think it's not something you're going to be brilliant at, go to the thing you think you can make your mark in. So I
Yeah.
gave up a long time ago, and I never really missed it until, as we say, I was writing one of the writing team on the stage version of Spike Milligan's Cocoon, and I was only there to write the songs and a couple of scenes, and through rehearsals, we decided that the music should be live. So suddenly I was in the wings playing piano on tour. That was going to be the plan. And then we got to do some scenes where there was nobody free to give a line. And so the director would say, well, Paul's just sat in the wings doing nothing. He can do that line. And I thought, well, all right then. So I got a line here and there. And then eventually I came into rehearsals one day, the piano was on stage. So they'd obviously decided that if we're paying him, we might as well see him. And and then eventually I ended up in scenes. And then, as you saw, I ended up sort of playing the role of the narrator in the whole
Yeah.
show, the kind of Spike character there. And I had an absolute ball doing that. We've toured that, I think, 3 times between 2009, 2016. We did it in the West End. And to this day, it's still a show that if the production company turned around and said they wanted to do it one more time. Well, that way they always said, "Well, one more time, we're going to do it one more
Yeah.
time," and I've said yes every time. But if they did do it one more time, I'd be a fool not to do it, because the part is written for me, and
Yeah.
how rare is that? I mean, I'm just myself on stage. There's no acting. It is performance.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a great time, but no, I'm not going to be. I've never auditioned. I'm not going to be, looking to play
No.
sort of Jean Valjean anytime soon.
You won't be tricked into appearing in any other shows now.
No,
No.
I'm wise to it now. I'm wise to it now. That was the one-off.
Well, Paul, you talked about how, at the very beginning of your career, you did everything, and that was, I'm sure, as much as anything else, out of necessity. Kind of starting out a career in the arts, you need to do as much as you can on a kind of shoestring budget. What do you think the state of the arts is now, kind of even pre-COVID, or if you take COVID out of the equation?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think if you were starting out in the arts now, you'd have been able to forge the same career for yourself? Or do you think there are just different challenges and obstacles now to sort of aspiring theatre makers?
I don't think. I think it's much more difficult now. I think that it was more difficult for me than it was for the generation before me, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it's more difficult for the generations that have followed after. Because I've not been based in Belfast, where I come from and where I first started my career. I have been watching it from afar. I'm not completely up to speed with what's going on there in terms of the number of theatre companies and what have you that are there. But I know that
Mm-hmm.
when we started, I left university and we started a theatre company, which was the thing you did. And there was 5 of us, so we started a theatre company, and we all acted in everything, wrote everything, produced everything.
Mm-hmm.
And within about 6 months of having that company up and running, we had Arts Council funding. And shortly after that, we had Sports Council funding. Not that we were sporty, but we got a minibus out of that.
Oh,
So
wow.
we were, and then we had office space, and this is all within the process of a year or so. That
Yeah.
wouldn't happen now, even if there were no other companies around. The mountains that you have to climb for funding are slightly different now. Fortunately, because of Macbeth the Musical, when we had all left university, we were known as the company that had produced that show, which had been very successful. So we were able to cash in on that. I don't know whether students nowadays get the opportunity to do anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. I can't imagine that I would have a career. I think I'd get lost in I was unremarkable enough to have got lost in all of those around me. I think if I was to do it now, if it was happening now.
I think you're being very modest there, Paul. I don't think there's anything unremarkable about
Oh, it's
the
very
the
kind.
work that you've done. And you mentioned that theatre company, Kibosh. Is that right? And it's
Kibosh,
still
yeah.
going.
Kiboshes, yeah, they did. I mean, obviously, none of us from the originals, none of us are
Yeah.
still alive. Um, yeah, we call ourselves the Continuity Kibosh, which is a whole Northern Irish joke in joke. But none of us, we're very pleased to see the company there. The name of the company still exists. And I mean, we started that in 1994. So, I mean, it must be 26 years old.
26 years. Yeah. Wow.
It's still going. It's one of the bigger theatre companies in Northern Ireland. As I say, it's a very different company now. It's been very
Mm-hmm.
difficult in some ways to watch it from afar because it's so different. When we set it up, it was essentially an entertainment company. We did musicals, we did tours
Mm-hmm.
to schools, we did dance pieces. It was we just tried to plug the gaps where the other professional companies weren't producing work.
Yeah.
Whatever they weren't producing, we did. And we became very versatile and very, and after that, we all sort of left and went off into our own different fields. Mine was musical theatre, obviously. But it's great to see the company still going. It means that whatever foundations were put in place all those years ago we had good foundations, and the company's
Absolutely.
still
Yeah.
doing very well.
Yeah. It's really lovely to see. And as you say, very different now, but to kind of see how the company's evolved, that must be very satisfying.
It's great.
Um,
It's great whenever you see their name crop up every now and again. You do kind of go, I remember the night we sat down and made up that word, kabosh. I met or the arguments. It was probably an argument. I remember the argument we had to come up with that name, kabosh.
Well, Paul, 25 minutes in here, I should really ask you about your dream dinner party.
Yeah, well,
It's
listen,
why
I've got
we're
no appetite.
here.
I've lost my appetite now. We've been talking for so long. I'm past hunger.
The pre drinks just went on too long.
Yes.
So before we learn about the kind of the specifics of where it would be and who would be there and what you'd be eating, you are someone who I think enjoys hosting a good dinner party. You always see. I think you're a fun host. What's the vibe of a typical Paul Boyd dinner party?
I think it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. I think I have that kind of come hungry and come often. Um, I find it impossible to make a meal for two. So there's in any night at our house could be a dinner party. But it's all about catching up with friends. I mean, anytime I have dinner parties, it's because there are friends I have not seen. When you live in London, people that you've known for years can live up the street, and you see them once a year if you're lucky. You know, we never ever think of.
Yeah,
I see friends who live abroad almost as regularly as I see friends who live down the street here. And
yeah,
so a dinner party is a great way of getting people round, and also a great way of mixing groups of friends. So there's, food being the great common denominator between us all, a good
yeah.
conversation piece. It's a relaxing atmosphere. So dinner parties are much better, I think, than a drinks party, where the only objective is to find something colourful and get drunk, as far as I can see.
Yes. And the great thing with the dinner party, I suppose, is that the two aren't mutually exclusive. You can always
Yes, of
get a little
course.
bit tipsy at a dinner party too, but
It
maybe in a
very often
slightly more
helps.
responsible way. Well, fantastic. So, Paul, we know the vibe. Where, if you could host it anywhere in the world, where do you think you would like to host this dinner party?
Well, this I hadn't given any thought to this, but I think that the obvious thing to do was, first of all, I would definitely host it at home because
Yep.
I like being at home. I like having my things around me, knowing where everything is. I
Hmm.
would probably do it in the garden,
Yes.
because again, people can walk around the garden and look at the flowers, and sort of again that gives you different areas to sit. Good weather, get some umbrellas up, and what have you. So a good open air dinner party, I think, would be great. Then it means anyone who needs to smoke can go off in the corner and do that without leaving the room,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
people can wander about and sit on the grass and that kind of thing. So a
That
garden
sounds
party, I think.
perfect. I think if anybody wanted to see the very garden, you keep such a lovely garden and you post the occasional picture on Twitter. So we'll
Yeah,
post a link to your Twitter account in the
thank you.
episode
Yes.
description so that people can really picture this party. So we know where it is. We know that it's going to be a lovely sunny evening and everyone's going to be hanging out in your garden. And your first guest is
Mm,
J.M. Barrie. And
yes.
you've written stage versions of so many kind of really well loved literary works. But what is it about J.M. Barrie as opposed to someone like Lewis Carroll or Victor Hugo or the Brothers Grimm? Why does J.M. Barrie kind of fascinate you enough to be one of your five guests?
Uh, I think J.M. Barrie is an enigma, and in the way that the others are not. Um,
Mm.
Barrie, I did a lot of. I wrote Peter Pan last year for the Lyric Theatre Belfast in association with Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children, and uh, I have to say, I always do a sort of 3 months research on any topic before I sit down to write. And I suddenly realized about 6 months in that I still hadn't put pen to paper. I was still reading about J.M. Barrie.
Yeah,
So many books, so many not autobiographies, biographies,
yeah,
and then so many versions of his own history that he'd written himself. And you still come out of it after all of that research, not much wiser than when you went in. So I don't know whether he was a nice person or not. I don't think he was. I think he was a very quiet man. I know that if he came to the dinner party, he wouldn't speak. He
yeah.
would sit in the corner and cough. He had a terrible cough, which in today's climate would cause panic.
It would.
But we'll pretend that there is no COVID at this point. Um, so coughing Barry in the corner. Yeah, again, I've so much research and so many sort of nefarious deeds he was involved in, and so many conspiracies and things for which there's evidence that I would just, I don't think I would have the nerve to ask him any questions, and I'm not sure I'd get any answers from him anyway. But I
Yeah,
always think if you meet someone, you can tell how
you get a
truthful they're
sense
being
of
or how
them.
genuine they are. And having him at the party and seeing him interact with my other guests, I think I would leave knowing a little bit more about him than I can possibly learn from the books and articles that I've read.
That's interesting. That very much leans into your Miss Marple thing that you said
Yes. Oh,
earlier.
I would have the trug and the flopsy hat with the scarf under the chin, definitely.
When it came to Peter Pan, was this an idea that the lyric came to you with, or did you say to the lyric, "I would love to tackle this story"? Were you always a
I've
fan
had
of Peter Pan?
Yeah, I've had Peter Pan on the list for a long time, but I've never ever had the nerve to suggest it because it's an expensive show. I mean, the minute
Yes.
that's why it's not done very often by regional theatres. I mean, not even just for the flying, but the size of the cast and blah, blah, blah. So I
Yeah.
didn't suggest it. It was the lyric who came to me. Alice was running at the time in the theatre, and we were looking for a title for the following year, and they suggested Peter Pan, and I nearly fell off my chair. And I went, yeah, God, yes, absolutely, Peter Pan, because I thought you haven't thought this through. I mean, you just don't. Let's just sign now, and then after we'd signed, I kind of, you do realise, as you know, that the original play is 4 hours long, because it has to be based on the original. There's all kinds of regulations and stuff, which again was my challenge. I was telling you earlier about how writing a new show. What's interesting is the challenge.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
challenge with Peter Pan is that the rights are still held, even though Barry died in 1936. The rights are still held by Great Ormond Street Hospital, Children's Hospital,
Yeah.
which is who he donated the rights to. And so, in order to do an adaptation, you've got to get their permission. You've got to get permission from Samuel French, who owned the 1904 play.
Oh wow.
Um, and sorry, the 1929 play was when he finally, it was first staged 1904, but he finished kind of tinkering with it 20 odd years later.
Oh gosh.
1928, give the rights to Great Ormond Street 1929. So you've all these people telling you what you can and cannot do with the show. And little stipulations like you can't change character names. The name Tinkerbell must be two words, Tinkerbell, as opposed to
Oh
Tinkerbell, which
wow.
sometimes you say. Little things like that. Individual pirates have to keep the same names and things. So
Yeah.
my job was to see how much of an adaptation I could do. How much can I change this story to make a good story? Because I would argue that the original does not have a tremendous narrative. And I think we did that, and everyone was very happy with it. The charities were happy with it. Samuel
Hmm.
French were happy with it. So that was the challenge then. But I would never have dared go to the lyric and say, "Well, can we do Peter Pan?" I mean, you might as well say, "Can we do Ben Hur?" You know.
That's it's such a fascinating thing, and I think it's sometimes maybe something that uh, people outside of theatre wouldn't necessarily think of all those myriad of different factors that you've got to kind of contend with. Was it was it an enjoyable challenge to sort of have the that kind of straitjacket of so many rules that you have to write to, or did you
Yes,
want
it
to kind
was.
of throw it out the window?
No, it was tremendous fun, and I guess that's where all the research came in because I did so much research that by the time I sat down to do it, I knew every word of the book, the play, because there's not just one Peter Pan. There's two novels and that he wrote, and the
Hmm.
play version that he wrote. So there's lots of source materials. I knew them all, and I could write in his style, not music, because Barry was tone deaf. So I'm hoping I didn't write in his style. But in terms of the script, I'm very proud of the script for Peter Pan because it
Yeah,
is I have taken, you've got to, you're told you've got to write in his style. And I think I got that. And I managed to create a story from his 4 hour play. I managed to create sort of a 2 hour story that hits all the high notes that the audience are expecting, and yet it's a
yeah.
new story in there. It's a different way of looking at Peter Pan.
That's a phenomenal achievement. Speaking of kind of going back to J.M. Barrie for a bit, he had a life that was sort of quite beset by personal tragedies, and you alluded earlier to some accusations of kind of impropriety in his life as well. All of this
Mhm.
stuff clearly influenced and inspired his work. You being aware of these kind of, for want of a better word, kind of sinister undertones, or
Yeah.
potentially sinister undertones to what inspired his work, was that a difficult thing to get your head around and sort of try to forget about that and just focus on the kind of purity of the story?
It was sinister is a great word. I mean, he called himself sinister. He called himself a
Ah.
sinister little man. So that's a great word to use. Um, what can I say? All of the accusations about Barry are not connected to the obvious. So we're not talking about a man who had any kind of sexual proclivities. In fact, he
Mm-hmm.
was completely asexual. So I never had a kind of a guilt in kind of the way I did with Lewis Carroll when I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
adapt his work. You just have to block him out completely because to open that can of worms, um, is too much. It just would bleed into the show in some way.
Yeah.
Barry's the conspiracies and the thoughts about Barry as a man are not connected to that in any way. They're connected to his double dealing and his the way that he was. How can I put it? He was a journalist in the true sense of the word. He journaled everything in his life.
Yeah.
Everything that is in Peter Pan is something that happened to him. Barry had a fantastic way. If Barry saw an accident happening at the end of the road, he would be telling you about it as if he was there standing in the middle of the accident, probably the cause of the accident. But he was a complete revisionist. He revised his entire life, made up. This is one of the reasons why meeting him in person, you get to see through all of the kind of the mists and the cloud that he threw up in front of
Yeah. Yeah.
himself. He wanted to be an enigma. He was desperate to be a myth. So that was really interesting for me. And the idea of this kind of double dealing, well, I just feed that into the character like Hook. Don't forget James Hook. Like, in my version, it's a woman, but the original James Hook. I mean, James was Barry's name. That was him.
Yeah.
Much more so than any other character. So it was a fascinating backdrop to write against, but it wasn't. I think if there had been any kind of sexual proclivities or suggestions, I would have found that a little bit harder to deal with. I might
Yeah.
have tainted everything, but no, the kind of just his manipulation. He was a manipulator, and that was a fantastic kind of backdrop, because as a writer, isn't that what we're doing to an audience? You're manipulating them to feel certain ways. So in some ways, he was inspirational.
Yeah. Well, he's certainly, in terms of a first guest for your dinner party, I think we've already picked out your wild card for the evening because he's
Yes.
not the qualities that he's bringing. I wouldn't necessarily associate with being the ideal dinner party guest, but
No, and I think if we were to issue him an invite, we would tell him to come half an hour later than everybody else. I mean, you don't want to start with him. That's an awful opening to any dinner party. Come and meet my
yes, yeah.
friend Jimmy Barry, sat in the corner coughing on his own.
Well, J.M. Barrie's there, and obviously he's written for stage. You've written for stage, but your quota for theatre writers and composers isn't filled yet because your next guest is one half of one of the most famous musical theatre duos ever. You're inviting Arthur Sullivan.
Yes, I am. He is a bit of a wild card for me, I have to say.
Oh,
Um, uh, Gilbert, I'm a huge Gilbert and Sullivan fan. I don't. You'll probably not remember, but back when I was at university, my dissertation for my degree was all about the history of Gilbert and Sullivan.
oh
I've
wow.
always adored Gilbert and Sullivan's work, and Gilbert actually would probably make a much more entertaining um, guest if you had to invite. Well, I wouldn't invite them both together because they didn't necessarily get on all the time. But
Yeah.
I feel it. Arthur Sullivan was a bit more of a playboy, and I think he would be great fun. Arthur Sullivan was no stranger to the gaming tables in Monte Carlo.
Aha.
A lot of the work that Sullivan took on, including the work he did with Gilbert, he did purely for financial gain to fund his very elaborate life.
I
He
see.
was, if I remember right, I can't remember dates. It's been a long time since I did any work on them, but he was. I remember somebody in one of the papers at the time wrote that Arthur Sullivan is basically the court composer of Victoria's court composer,
Mm.
in a way that Gilbert was never the court jester. They moved in very different circles, but I always think Arthur Sullivan would have been tremendous fun at a
Yeah.
party. He was quite flamboyant, and also I'm a big fan of his work. I mean, he wrote tunes, which he also attempted to write opera, but he really did write tunes, and there is a very strong argument for the fact that Gilbert and Sullivan were the first people to create what we would now call musical theatre. The Americans
Yeah.
can always contest that, but I think the evidence is there from the work of GNS.
Yeah. And am I right in saying so? Arthur Sullivan was all about the music, and Gilbert was the lyricist. Is that
That's it.
correct?
Yeah, yeah. So Arthur Seymour Sullivan. His initials were Ass, which is why he never used the word Seymour. So Sir Arthur. He was Doctor Sullivan, and then he became Sir Arthur Sullivan long before Gilbert became Sir William Gilbert.
Right.
Um, so there was a bit of contention there, but he was the musician and a great pianist, a fantastic pianist. He'd be great at the dinner party because I get the feeling that he would have been there with his cigarette holder hanging out of his mouth, heading
Mm-hmm.
straight for that piano to give us a bit of something that he'd
Oh,
just
so
written.
kind of dinner
Yeah,
and a show.
yeah. I wouldn't tell him that when he got there, but I don't think he could resist the piano.
Yeah. Has Arthur Sullivan or kind of the work of Gilbert and Sullivan directly influenced the way that you write music and musicals?
Yeah, I don't know whether I could actually put my finger on it, and I don't know whether it's true now, but certainly when I started, the work of Gilbert and Sullivan was the thing I knew the most about.
Mm-hmm.
I knew every note of every song, I knew every stage version. I was a big fan of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company. So, in terms of structure, and that's more Gilbert than it is Sullivan, but in terms of structuring a show, I mean, W.S. Gilbert, he's not invited to the party. I know this, but we'll talk about him to annoy Sir Arthur. W.S. Gilbert effectively invented the role of stage management. There was no stage managers in
Oh.
theatre. It was, it was the director did everything, and stage hands. But the idea of having a book in the theatre, we have a book which is the script with all the right moves written into it.
Mm-hmm.
That was a Gilbert invention, and those books still exist. Those books, Gilbert's original books, still exist. And up until the 80s, when the original D'Oyly Carte Opera Company closed, they were still staging the shows exactly to his notes. And they were sort of a museum piece by the 80s, which led to their downfall. But
Mm.
he was an innovator, and Sullivan, I think, uh, brought interest to the shows because he was seen as the Great White Hope. uh, that's how he was described at the time, the Great White Hope
Mm-hmm.
of British music. Um, uh, People couldn't understand why he was writing these sort of West End Savoy operas, as they were called, but they were basically early West End musicals. Why was he writing those and not off writing great oratorios and symphonies and things, which he did also do? But then the truth was that he made a great deal of money from his stage work, and he
Yeah.
brought to it a quality, an etherealness, if you like. He was almost too good for the work, and so adding his uh, beautiful and very high standard musical compositions to Gilbert's very pointed, very satirical punch cartoon style scripts,
Yeah.
elevated them to something that every other musical created at the time has since fallen into obscurity. So I think Sullivan, a lot of the longevity of Gilbert and Sullivan is to do with Sullivan's music, and I'd love to tell him that.
Yeah. It's
He'd,
really
he'd
interesting
love
that
that. He'd love to hear that.
who wouldn't love to hear that though? It's interesting that you brought that up because that was something that I kind of read about in advance of this that he was criticized in the media and the idea was that the supreme talent he had that he was lending to something that was ultimately too frivolous and it was kind of beneath him. Um, do you think that's a fair criticism?
I think it was at the time. Don't forget, we're talking about a period when the word theatre wasn't really used to describe what we now call a theatre. Theatres were akin to brothels. And what happened was you had lots of anybody who ran a theatre would find some way of describing it without using the word theatre. And therefore, you end
See,
up with these fantastic buildings called galleries of illustration. Rather than use the word theatre,
yeah,
theatres were music halls, where which was debauchery and
uh-huh.
filthy songs and people throwing things at each other, everything that you can imagine. So the idea that Sullivan would put himself amongst those people, it was a bit, I guess, a bit like when Mozart wrote the Magic Flute. I guess it was the
Hmm.
same kind of thing. We had this kind of composer writing something popular, something populist. Um, the difference was that Sullivan happened to be doing it just at the time when operetta was becoming a thing. Offenbach was very popular, and they were very much seen as writing the British cleaner versions of the very naughty French operettas that Offenbach was writing. And
Hmm.
along came Richard D'Oyly Carte with a huge pot of money and opened the Savoy Theatre. But there, you were using the word theatre for the first time, and it sort of suddenly had respectability. So Arthur came along to it at just the right time.
Yeah.
But I think there still was a case of, oh my God, why is he working with that sort of cartoonist and columnist W.S. Gilbert? And what is he doing having shows on in London that are not at the opera houses? Certainly, the
Yeah.
beginning of their career together, that was true. It wasn't so much towards the end.
And as success kind of came to them, and as they became very financially successful, commercially successful, do you think that that was the kind of marked beginning of your kind of opera audience maybe opening their eyes a little bit to the fact that things don't have to be so dreadfully serious all the time?
Yes, because opera was all about gods and monsters and
Hmm.
and Mount Olympus, and ironically, the first show that Gilbert and Sullivan wrote together, which doesn't exist anymore because it was lost, was a musical called Thespis, or The Gods Grown Old, which was set on Mount Olympus. And that was done at, I think I'm right in saying it was done at the very theatre I mentioned, the Gallery of Illustration. It was only performed for a short time and it was then taken off, and it was a good 10 years before they worked together again. But that, I guess, was the segue into leading audiences who were used to those themes in opera into slightly more accessible forms of theatre, which their shows definitely were. You know, people laughed. The shows were hysterical. They were satirical. They were on point. They were cutting edge, which is a horrible phrase which I never use, but they really were at the time. You know,
Hmm.
if you went to see a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, you were going to see something that was commenting on life in the way that we would pick up a satirical magazine today or a
Yeah,
TV show. It was, it was almost like a spitting image, to use
yeah,
a thing from today. You would go and you'd see Society lampooned and famous characters from Society lampooned, thinly disguised by these characters that Gilbert created. So it really was on the cusp of topicality and modernism.
yeah.
And
It's
Arthur Sullivan to that added a gloss of beautiful music, so that if you didn't want to see those things, you could just sit back and talk about how fabulous the tunes were.
Yeah, yeah. That's really fascinating. On that, I'm kind of endlessly fascinated by this idea of sort of high art, and it's something. And I can edit this out afterwards if you're not happy with me saying this. But I remember
Mm-hmm.
speaking to you after Cocoon at the Leicester Square Theatre, and I was
Mm-hmm.
raving about it, and I'd laughed the whole way through. And you said to me, "It's not high art, but it's great fun." And you said those words to me, and I remember kind of thinking, "But what is high art then? I mean, it was so effective and so brilliant at what it set out to do, which was to make people laugh. It was as quality a version of that end goal as any I'd seen. So I don't know what kind of wouldn't make something high art just because it makes people laugh. You can see my bias as a stand up comedian coming in here as well.
Yes, yes. But I think what I probably meant, I don't remember saying that, but I think what I was probably meant was I don't think it's a quality thing, because I think that there are lots of very low art examples of low art that are beautiful quality. But
Yeah,
I think I was probably joking about the fact that there we were in London, where there's a lot of money spent on some very high art productions down the road at places like the Royal Opera House, and
yes,
I'd
yeah.
probably come out of a very sweaty dressing room, having just sat at a piano for 2 hours while somebody dressed as a woman hit me over the head with a policeman's truncheon. I mean, that's the level, that's Spike's level. So,
Yeah.
but it's not high art, and Spike would certainly never have said it was high art. But it's not high art, but it was fun, and that was. But listen, I could say it about everything I've written in the past 30 years, and I'm quite happy with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a really interesting thing about how things are perceived and kind of like, stand up comedy is something that isn't eligible for Arts Council funding and that kind of thing. And I think there is this kind of perception sometimes that comedy isn't as legitimate as things that take themselves very seriously, even though, as you will well know, comedy is an exceptionally difficult thing to get right. And that's
Oh, I
something
think
that
it's more
Gilbert and
difficult.
Sullivan will have realized as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah, anybody, and I don't mean this in a detrimental in any way, but it is more difficult to write a funny play than it is to write a play.
Yeah,
Because in a sense, to write a funny play, you've got to write a play first and then make it funny.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
it's twice as much work. And some people find that easy and some people don't. Some people are born with funny bones. Some people work at it. Some people work in teams. But it is a shame. I think you're right. I think it is a shame that these things are not seen as art. Art is a difficult word. It's not a word I use very often because I always afraid that Joe Public judges us for being artists in a sense,
Yeah.
particularly at times like now when there are problems and everyone's vying for funding, and the idea that the hospitals need more money than the arts is an argument that you hear a lot, and of course it's true, but it doesn't mean that the arts is invaluable. And I
Yes.
worry that using art rather than entertainment or show business sometimes distances us from our audience. And
Yeah.
anybody sitting down to watch a Netflix drama at night, box set, doesn't think they're sitting watching art. They're being entertained. And sometimes it's an easier argument to make for funding and things if you can say, well, you entertain and occupy people, give them a good time, which is exactly what comedy does, stand up or otherwise. So, yes, it is a
Yeah.
shame that there isn't a broader brush in terms of definition.
It's a fascinating kind of semantic debate, isn't it?
And
But
that's all it is. That's all it is. Yeah.
yeah, really, at the end of the day, I'm sure Arthur Sullivan would probably just say, enough of this. Give me a cigarette and a piano.
Pass the
I'm not
wine.
interested.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, speaking of passing the wine, let's pass the bottle to your third guest. And this is something that doesn't happen very often on the dinner party, but your third dream dinner party guest is someone that I think you quite regularly have dinner with. You're inviting your pal Sue Pollard.
Yes. Yes, I am. In fact, I had dinner with her last night. Strangely, yes, Sue. I just Sue is the perfect dinner guest at any occasion. You could put Sue Pollard in a room with 100 people she doesn't know, and by the end they're all talking. And
Hmm.
I mean, she's my antidote to J.M. Barrie. I can't imagine J.M. Barrie would last very long in the corner with Sue there. But Sue has over many years has learned to command a room and to make people feel comfortable in a room. So, for example, if you go somewhere with Sue to a party, and there is food being passed around, the first thing Sue will do is to go to the kitchen and meet the staff and ask if she can take one of the trays. And Sue will then go around the room offering vol au vents or whatever happens to be on the tray to the
Hmm.
guests, none of whom she knows. And the reason she does that is she says it gives them a chance to say hello to me. And we can talk about something for a few seconds over, about the food that she has on offer or whatever she's doing. And then she can come away again and everyone feels like they've met her. And then she doesn't have a full evening of people pointing or people finding excuses to come over or Sue's very happy to meet
Yeah.
people that know her from the telly back in the 80s or the more recent stuff she's done. But she just has a way of working a room that actually means that you don't end up with uh, lots of people interrupting dinner or lots of people because she loved to meet them, but sometimes people find the most ridiculous reasons to come over.
Yeah.
You look familiar, or are you? I think I know who you are. All of that stuff. Well, she gets
Yeah.
that all out of the way. She'll take a pizza round, offer slices of pizza. So if we had her at the dinner party, she would be straight up to the salad bar, and she'd be lifting a few trays of stuff and going around, and she'd be putting that beetroot salad right under J.M. Barrie's nose and forcing him to divulge some kind of information that we could all do with.
She'd come back and just say, "Yep, you were right about him."
Yeah.
Told
Oh, I
you.
don't like him. Oh, I don't like him. She'd say.
Well, Sue, she's best known for a role in the BAFTA-winning sitcom Heidi High. But when did you first come to know Sue, or when did you? I guess were you a fan of Heidi High?
Oh yeah, that's my era. I mean, that as a kid, we watched Heidi High, and
Mm-hmm.
and the other one she did was a thing called You Rang My Lord, which
Mm-hmm.
was kind of a follow up to Heidi High, different story but the same cast, and those that was a fantastic show. If you hear her talk about that show, the money they spent on that was a very expensive show. It was a bit like the Downton Abbey of its day. In fact, that
Mm-hmm.
was it. It was a kind of an upstairs downstairs thing, but there was no expense spared on that show. She had silver service training for that show. All of the props and things were of the era. It was a very expensive show for the BBC to do, and I think that of all of them that she did, that was her favorite one. Every episode was 45 minutes long as opposed to half an hour, which means it
Hmm.
doesn't get repeated quite as often anymore because it doesn't fit into the schedules.
Yeah.
But I watched all of those, and I was very aware of her. And then when I moved to London, I used to see her out socially every now and again, because again, you can't be in a room with Sue and not know she's there.
Sure.
She's like a firework in the middle of the room. You kind of know that she's in all kinds of ways. And so I met her socially a few times, and then we were doing Molly Wobbly again. It was at Leicester Square Theatre in about, I don't know, 2015, I think it was, something like that. And she came to see it, and we got talking afterwards, and we've just been thick as thieves ever since. I've directed her a couple of times in Panto.
Ah, wow.
Yeah, she did. We do Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I did the Grand Theatre in Blackpool and the Assembly Hall, Tunbridge Wells. I directed her twice in that show, and just had an absolute blast. So yeah, we see each other a lot, and there's a kind of a group of us that kind of get together whenever we possibly can,
Yeah.
and keep up to date. We've been zooming. I mean, who knew Pollard knew how to zoom? I mean, she's a Zoom fiend. She can zoom on a train. She can zoom from anywhere. I need to be sat squarely at my desk facing the right wall, but no, she
Yeah,
can do it on the
definitely
move.
better than me. I can't zoom on the move.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you see a lot of her up her nose and stuff, but that's just because she's quite emotive
Part of the
and
pleasure.
effusive, part of the pleasure. But yeah, so I doubt you've got to. I wouldn't have a dinner party without her being there because she is the very embodiment of breaking the ice.
That is high praise indeed for any dinner party guest. I mean, I'm assuming as well that she's got some terrific stories because she's worked with some kind of exceptional talent, people like Tracy Ullman and Tim Brooke Taylor and Andrew Sachs. Does
Oh,
she
she
kind of
goes.
share stories of all these
Yeah,
people with you?
she's very happy to talk. I mean, she's not not a clanger, not a name dropper. But if you
Sure.
ask her about something, every now and again something will come up, and I'll say, "Did you ever work with him?" And you go, "Yes," and then there'll be some filthy story connected to it. Or so. I mean, this woman, my wedding 2 years ago. This gives you the measure of this woman. So this woman, before my wedding, I'd had a chat with her, and I'd said, right, I need you. We're not doing like a disco after the wedding. We're having a cabaret show. So that
Hmm.
all of my friends who are performers all will do a turn. That's their gift. That's what I wanted a show. I said, and I want you to do. Oh yes, of course I'll do it. But I think what I'll do, she said, I'm not going to do a song. I'm going to do a sketch. I'll do a bit of a sketch. Right, fine. Okay, so then she turns up on the day looking gorgeous. And I said, are you ready for the show? What show? Well, she'd forgotten all about it. So she had about an hour and a half to prepare. And so she got up. I put her towards the end of the show to give her more time. And she stood up and she did a set that I can only imagine. She cobbled it together from jokes that she'd heard at school, filthy limericks. There's there's a story about a woman sitting in the front row of the church that I cannot tell you until you're at least 40 years old. And she she absolutely stole the show, and we took a video of it, and you can hear me screaming with laughter because I was sitting with my friend Jamie Steen, who is one of our gang, and we both know how far these stories can go, or the level of filth and hilarity these can get to. And she was towing the line, and then the foot went slightly over the line, and Jamie and I got the giggles, thinking, "Oh God, please let her stop at that joke because I know what the next joke is." So she's a consummate performer and has stories about everyone, and has worked with some, because she's done royal variety shows.
Mm.
She's done big tours of all kinds of shows and musicals, from Little Shop of Horrors, Rocky Horror. She did Annie. She didn't play Annie. She played Miss Hannigan. But yeah, I mean, she's just got fantastic stories, and we'll happily talk about them if you're at all interested.
Yeah. She
And
sounds
has tremendous
absolutely
insight.
fascinating.
Tremendous insight.
Yeah. Is she someone that you kind of bounce creative ideas off of, or when you're together, is it just kind of away from work and just purely focused on having a good time?
It tends to be the latter. When we do work together, so for example, if in the run up to rehearsal starting for pantomime, she and I and the musical director will have got together for a few days on and off in the run up to rehearsals, where we'll
Hmm.
rattle through her songs so that she has some preparation under her belt before we start rehearsals.
Yeah.
And those sessions are very much about bouncing ideas off each other. What about if we did this? And what about if we did change the lyrics to this and do a bit of that? Those are tremendous sessions, and she's very creative that way, and writes a lot of lyrics and stuff herself.
Hmm.
For when you're in a panto and you want some lyrics changed for a song, chances are she's got 4 versions in a notebook. She has a Hannibal Lecter like scroll in a notebook, and one of those versions will be right on the money. But when we're out, we tend to be talking about work we have coming up and family stuff and plans we're doing and where we might go next and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It tends not to be about the specifics of work.
Oh, she sounds like the ideal dinner party guest. I can totally see why you're inviting her. Your next guest is someone that I would be inviting to my dream dinner party as
Ah,
well.
really?
And he's also I've done this on I ran the dinner party as a little mini series on BBC Oxford, and this is episode 4 of the podcast, and this is this person's fourth appearance, so he's by far and
Wow,
away the most popular dinner party guest, which just demonstrates how beloved he is.
how
You're inviting
fantastic!
the incomparable Jim Henson.
Yeah, I am. What can I say about Jim Henson that hasn't already been said, even on your show?
Yeah.
Except that he is a part of my childhood that was very special to me, and
Mhm.
that I still think back on very fondly. And I feel, as so many of us did, I felt as a child like I knew him.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, I grew up in Belfast, as you know,
Mhm.
which was a million miles away from the rest of the world. I mean, and we're talking about there was a lot of troubles in
Mhm.
Northern Ireland at that point anyway. Something like the Muppet Show coming along um, was filmed in London. And I think even as a child of 4 or 5 or 6, I knew that. I knew everything about the Muppets. I knew all the different performers who did
Mhm.
what. I knew where they started. I knew I could sing all the songs. I could mouth all the sketches. I had the albums. And the idea that it was filmed in London was really exciting because that London was like a dream world. It might as well have been on the moon, but
Mhm.
something, the idea that he wasn't that far away, the Muppets were not that far away. And I have collected puppets my entire life. I've always been obsessed with puppets and have in my later years become very fond of um, catching up with what the Muppet performers of old are doing now.
Mhm.
I spent my birthday evening this year, it was during lockdown, on a Zoom conference
Was
with.
this the Muppet Guys talking thing?
No, no, that was fantastic. That's a little film that the documentary they did, but they did a Zoom conference one night. It was on the night of my birthday. Your birthday's in April, isn't it?
Yes,
You
yeah.
16th,
25th.
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 I'm
I'm just
18th. So
after you, a week after you.
yeah, I'm just before you. So that night I did a Zoom conference with Frank Oz and Dave Goles. And I was one of 50 people or something in the room and got to ask a question and
Oh,
things. And that
wow.
just to me is just phenomenal. And yeah, so and I read a biography of him recently by
Oh, was this the
Brian.
Brian May Jones one?
Yes, Brian May Jones, who's a fantastic
Yeah.
writer in his
I've
own right.
started it. I haven't finished it yet.
It's a fantastic. Well, I listen to the audiobook, which is something I do sometimes when I'm walking the dog,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and it was very, very insightful and very loving and very honest, and I think has the seal of approval of some of the family and people who
Yes,
now
it
run
was
the
it was kind
Henson
of written with full
organization.
cooperation of the family and the Jim Henson
Um,
Company, yeah.
but I came out of that. There's no shock to the end of Jim's story. When Jim
Yeah.
died in 1990, is that right?
Yeah,
Um,
around then, yeah.
but I've got to tell you, when that comes up in the book, it's still a stab in the heart. It really
Mm-hmm.
is, and I cannot fathom why we all feel that way about him. Um, but we do, and one of the
Yeah.
reasons to have him at the party is just to soak up some of that hippie-ish, beatniky, all together creative team builder that he was, soak up some of that atmosphere because I think we could do with a bit more of that in the creative
Yeah.
industries.
100%. This the thing that everyone I speak to about Jim Henson, and the reason why I love him so much as well, is that the spirit of everything he ever made, Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Labyrinth, all of it, Muppets especially, the spirit of it is just so pure, so friendly and hopeful, and positive and inclusive. And does that spirit of his work influence the way you write? I asked you about it with Sullivan, um, but the spirit of Henson, is that something that you try to inject a little bit of into your shows?
Definitely. And I don't, maybe not so much as the writer, but definitely as the director.
Uh huh.
I'm only interested in putting together a team that will be a family. Um, I don't do divas. I don't do the male equivalent of divas. I'm not
Hmm.
interested in putting bums on seats by using someone who will not be a good person to have around. That very occasionally that comes up. More often than not, we're very fortunate, and I get, as director, get to pick my companies. And sometimes I said to you earlier that sometimes auditions are kind of the worst way to find
Hmm.
um, the cast members. I'm much more interested in seeing somebody perform, whether that's live on stage or on tape or whatever, and
Hmm.
then meet them. And the meeting of them is almost more important. If you can sing, you can sing. If you're a funny actor, you're a funny actor. I just give you funny lines, you'll be funny. But you've got to be part of the family. And that sounds like such a cliche, but it's absolutely true. And I believe that comes across to the audience. I believe if you have seven
Yeah.
or eight people on stage who've had an absolute blast in rehearsals, have laughed themselves silly,
Hmm.
have supported each other, have had trying times and joyful times, all in that sort of 4 or 5 week rehearsal period leading up to a show, that very much is something I learned from reading about and understanding how people like the Muppet guys all worked together in the early days and formed this kind of weird ragtag band of people with foam on their hands, you know. So that's
Yeah.
very much something that I believe, because we know from experience that watching things like Muppets and Fraggles and what have you, that love comes across, and that
It does.
there's
Yeah.
nothing else in the shop but somebody's hand. So there's something magical there, and it is.
Yeah.
I think it is that sort of cooperation. He also was a very quiet man. So again, he's somebody else. Pollard could have a bloody good go out with a mushroom vol au vent, you know.
Absolutely. He only really seemed to come out of his shell when he had a Muppet on his hand.
And the thing I find fascinating, and I only learned this a couple of years ago, was because I've heard stories about other puppeteers, and you get someone, for example, like Rod Hull. Do you remember Rod Hull with Emu?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, this is a story I've heard from people in the business. But Rod would, when he was doing Emu, would walk around with the Emu kind of tucked behind him. I'm doing it now, even though you can't see it. I need you to know I'm actually doing it. So he would have the puppet on his right hand, and as he was walking, he would tuck it behind him. So if he's walking from one place to another backstage, you didn't look at the puppet. You know, it was just tucked away. And then when he came out on stage, up the puppet came. The puppet was carried about in a plastic bag, yeah, a
Hmm.
Tesco bag or something. It was just, and I always thought it was interesting how um, we never got to see the puppeteers on things like the Muppets or Sesame
Yeah.
Street.
Yeah.
And then I learned that actually that wasn't a thing. That wasn't them being precious. I went to see, very fortunate, I got to see the Muppets live at the O2 a couple of years
I saw
ago.
that show as well. It was
Oh my
just
God, it was,
breathtaking.
and watching, because I thought, how are they going to do it? Are they all going to be what they call a headboard? Are they all going to be behind the platform and only we
Hmm.
could just see their forearms? But no, they were there. They were whizzing about on chairs. We could see, we could choose to watch the puppeteer or watch the puppet.
Yeah.
And that openness, I realized then watching lots of old videos of Jim on chat shows and him sitting in conversation with Frank Oz. They would literally have a sports bag and the puppets were in it. There was nothing magical for him about the puppets. There was nothing amazing or otherworldly about the puppets. It was a bag of rags, and he would pick
Hmm.
it up and he would make it magic, and then he would just pull it off his arm and throw it into the bag. There was none of this kind of we must put it in a felt-lined box and close the lid. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Which I always assumed would be the case on something
Yeah.
like that, and I find that really refreshing because as a puppeteer, anything I've done has been in a room where somebody has a fake fur coat, and you pick up the fur coat and you put your arm down the sleeve and it becomes a mouth, and you start messing about and you think, well, that's obviously a different league to what they were doing. And then you think, actually, no, it's not far removed from what they were doing.
Yeah.
And I love that about them. And that's a fairly new discovery. I learned a lot of that from Brian May Jones's book.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I don't think I've ever told you that I did say it on last week's podcast. So for any listeners, I apologize for sounding like a broken record every time Jim Henson comes up. But I was an extra in the last Muppet movie, so I got to sit
I
in
think you
the.
did tell me
Did I
this.
tell you this?
I
And
think
it's
so. But tell me again.
It's just amazing. What really struck me was, so I got to sit. You know how they're touring around the world and they go to Dublin, and
Yes.
the weird thing was I just got this email saying, "Are you kind of ginger Irish and near enough to London?" And I don't know how they got my details, but I'm so glad they emailed. But I went along and we sat in this kind of fake theater where we were watching this Muppet Show in Dublin. But the thing that struck me was that in between takes, the Electric Mayhem were down in the orchestra pit, and the
Hmm.
Muppeteers between takes. You think they would just rest their arm, but they cared so much about how the Muppets were perceived that you just had kind of Dr. Teeth and Janice just having a little chat between takes and flicking through their sheet music. And you weren't seeing kind of Muppeteers resting
So
between
they were
takes. They
alive.
were
They were alive
always
the whole time.
on. So
Yeah.
then when it came to lunchtime and they took the Muppets off and left them on the chair, it was really disconcerting walking past the orchestra pit and just seeing Janice lying still on a
Oh
chair.
wow.
I kind of
Yeah.
wanted to call
Yeah.
an ambulance for her. But it
Yeah.
was phenomenal just how much they cared about how they were perceived. That was something that really struck me about that.
And
If
what a
if
brilliant legacy he Henson left, and
yeah.
it goes on now to. I mean, I absolutely adored the Dark Crystal series that they did last year, and the Age of, what do they call it?
Oh,
It was on Netflix. Age of
yeah,
something.
Resistance was
Age
it?
of Resistance. Ah, it was phenomenal. And again, all part of the legacy that Jim Henson left.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, he is just so beloved for such good reason. If Jim could bring one Muppet with him to the dinner party, who would you want him to bring along?
Well, now, well, if it was one of Jim's puppets, Rolf the dog, who was the puppet he had the longest association with, again, he might have to push Sullivan out of the way of the piano and give me a bit of four-fingered honky tonk. But if I'm absolutely honest, my favorite Muppet is Gonzo, and that's a Dave Goelz puppet.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't know whether Jim could bring Gonzo. I always said I'm not starstruck very often. I'm fortunate enough to get to work with some big names in my career, but if I ever met Shirley Bassey or Gonzo, those are the two who would leave me speechless. I wouldn't know what to say. I've never met either of them. I've seen them both in concert, but I've never met
Yeah.
either of them. So if Jim could bring anyone, he might have to sneak Dave Goelz in through the back gate of the garden so that I could have a chat with Gonzo.
I think we could allow that. I think that would be a very good thing to do. Well, Jim Henson is a phenomenal fourth guest, and your last guest is someone else who's very directly influenced your work. You're inviting. We've mentioned Cocoon a few times throughout the podcast. You are currently working on a new version of a Spike Milligan production. You're inviting Spike Milligan to your dinner party.
Yes, I am. I am inviting Spike, who was on the Muppets Series 5.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't know that.
yeah, he was a Muppets guest at Series 5. And my friend Jane, who is Spike's daughter,
Hmm.
as a child, got to go on set uh, of the Muppets
Oh my
when
god.
her dad was the special guest, and she got into terrible trouble for putting on Miss Piggy. She did. She picked up Miss Piggy from the rack, put her hand in it, and got told off. You do not put your hand inside the Muppets. But she was a
Oh
kid. But anyway,
wow.
that still haunts her. But yes, I'm going to invite Spike. I did meet Spike. I did know Spike briefly. He was already a very elderly man by the time I'd met him. I met him in 2000 and now hold on a minute. 1998, and he died in 2002. So it was
Right.
he was quite decrepit at the time I met him.
Yeah.
I'd like to have him around because well, first of all, again, he would shock a few of the other guests that I have there. I mean, looking at the list, apart from Pollard, I've got Barry and Henson, both of whom are quiet people. Sullivan's playing the piano. So I think Spike and Sue might have a bit of a party of their own. I have a lot of love for Spike. I know the family very well, and as you say, I worked on Cocoon. I'm now working on a stage version of his a play of his war memoir, Adolf Hitler: My Part in His Downfall,
Yeah.
which I was asked to write by Norma Farnes, who was Spike's manager, who's since passed away. I'm
Oh.
continuing to work on it because the company, Spike Milligan Productions, which was Spike's company, is now being run by the family, by Jane and Celia and Laura.
Ah, okay.
who I know. So I'm continuing to work on that. Again, it was meant to be done at some point this year. That's on hold for now. But I am very well versed in all things Spike. I think when I met him, I went to, because he could be curmudgeonly. I went to reach for his arm. I think Jane said, "Daddy, this is Paul." And I went to reach for his arm to shake his hand. And
Yeah.
he said, "Get your filthy hand off my dirty arm." Um, which I've since learned was something he just said, and he would just go and shake his hand anyway. But I mean, I was only 20 something. I think I probably was quite put off by that.
That would be
But
rather
he has
intimidating, yeah.
he's fascinated me for a long time since then, since that point, and uh, a kind of sentimentality with me having Spike there. I wouldn't talk to him about work. I wouldn't talk to him about anything like that. But
Mm.
I'd love to be able to pass on some messages to him from his loved ones if he was there,
Oh,
and
yeah.
little things like that, and get some stories from him that I could take back, and his side of things that the kids remember and what have you.
Yeah.
I didn't know him well at all. I mean, I only met him once or twice, but I do feel like he is my friend's dad, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I think of him in that way. And it's always a bit of a shock when his name crops up on something on the telly, or he was the answer on a quiz or something. I still get that kind of moment where I think that's Jane's dad. Oh yeah, of course that, but he is Spike Milligan. And the
Yeah, yeah.
kids have an interesting, I say the kids, I mean, these are all grown ass men and women, but they have a very interesting way of talking about him when they're talking about him that he's dad, but when we're talking about work, he's Spike.
That's so
Spike wasn't his
interesting.
real name. Spike was the name he was given in the army. He was Terence. But so,
Uh-huh.
Spike spoke this and Spike did that and Spike wanted this and this has to be about Spike. That's different than them saying, oh, Dad used to do this, or that's where Dad used to get his bread from, or wherever. Because we all live in London now, not a stone's throw from where they all grew up. So I
Yeah.
live just down the road from two of the sisters, two of his daughters. Laura lives in Australia, but Jane and Celia live fairly near me, and the house they all grew up in is further up the road. And I can't walk anywhere in this part of London without passing a blue plaque that is Spike lived here, or
Yeah,
this
yeah.
way to Spike's statue. This is Milligan land that we're in, and it's a fantastic land to be in.
Well, the other
Um,
fascinating thing about him is that he essentially chose Irishness. He chose to be Irish in a
well,
sense,
yes,
born in India, and kind of moved to London, but made the decision to get his Irish passport, and it was something he was very proud of, wasn't it?
he was. He was. He came back from India. His father was in the Indian Army. He was discharged. They came back to London, and because his father was originally Irish from Sligo, they decided Milligan, Spike wasn't going to get a British passport. So in true Spike fashion, he said "F you." And he said, his story is that he phoned up the Irish consulate and said, "I'd like a passport," and they said, "Good, we're looking for people." So that is kind of how he got his Irishness through his heritage. And one of the great interesting things about working on Puckun, when we worked on Puckun, which is the story about how the Irish border was drawn, and the
Yeah.
idea that the border falls through a little village in Sligo, where and so one half of the church is in the north and the other half is in the south, and there's only one corner of the pub that's in the north of Ireland where drink is 30% cheaper. All of these kind of great guys. But it was set in a little village called Puckun that he made up, but actually he's populated it with people who he guesses are his ancestors. The lead character is called Dan Milligan, who isn't Spike, but it's somebody Spike imagines is one of
Yeah.
his family living there. And it's a place
Yeah.
full of idiots. I mean, for Spike, the world was full of idiots. And the sooner we all realize that, and my God, hasn't he been proven true? And
Certainly, yeah.
the sooner you just accept that, this is a great, if I've learned anything from Spike, it's this: the minute you can assume the world is just, and accept that the world is just full of idiots, the better you can just get on with things.
Kind of make sense of things a bit
I
quicker.
can watch anybody on the news now spiting anything because I just go, idiot, idiot. And when you come across someone who's not an idiot, be surprised, but don't do it the other way around. And that's what Spike did. All of his comedy is about laughing at authority and pulling the rug out of the people in power. It's all about the fact that the idiots are in charge, and
Yeah.
that's a great thing to take with you through life.
He's so quotable, and so I mean, just so many great gags. He was also for a time a jazz musician. And do you see any kind of sense of that kind of free form musicality in his writing?
Yes, that's his. He started off as a musician. He was a trumpeter in the army. Well, a jazz trumpeter. He took a trumpet with him to the army as a kid. He
Right.
was 18 or 19 when he was conscripted into the army, and they formed. This is all in the first book that I'm currently looking at.
Mm-hmm.
They formed a band called the Boys of Battery B, and they had a little jazz band. And you're absolutely right. There is something about the free form kind of, although they did cover versions of things at dances, of course, that's what they were
Mm-hmm.
paid for, but they really loved to scat and jazz and just riff on jazz. And that kind of living note to note is exactly what he did in his comedy. And that's how his brain worked. I mean, that was the kind of rapid fire, keep moving. Did that not work? Keep going, keep going.
Mm-hmm.
That's what jazz is. And yes, if his style of writing and style of comedy was anything, it was jazz. Because it was shortly after that period in his life, he went straight into writing The Goons, which is what kind of set up his style
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
introduced that style of comedy to the world because it hadn't existed before.
And then obviously without that, there's no Monty Python. There's no. I mean, so
Yeah, I mean,
much
you
of
can't
kind of.
imagine because Spike didn't invent comedy. He didn't even invent radio comedy. But what he did was he learned to package it. The way Spike packaged radio comedy
Mm-hmm.
as this kind of 25-minute train of thought with a break for some music and a man on a mouth organ, and then back to some more wacky comedy and people doing funny voices, and that hadn't been done before, and it certainly hadn't been packaged in a kind of, for the next 25 minutes anything can happen. We always say
Yeah.
Spike broke the fourth wall, but in a sense he did. But in a way, Spike broke all the walls. He didn't like walls. Spike's first job at any medium, radio, television, cinema, books, whatever he did, was to work out where the four walls are and then flatten them. And then that's why you end up with a book like Cocoon, where the reading voice, the narrator, the voice inside your head as you're reading it suddenly speaks to you. I don't like this anymore. I'm going off to page 56. It says, things like that. That's exactly the same as the Goons when somebody says, what? What's happening next? And boom, explode. Everything ends in an explosion. Or on the TV, the Q series, there's no tagline to a sketch. They all look at the camera and go, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? It's all madness. It's all a kind of free form. But yeah, and all of those are form breaking. And I guess that's what Spike was. And he did with poetry too. Anything he
Yeah.
touched, he worked out what the rules were and then worked out how to avoid them. And that is I think the through thought through everything that he did. Um, uh, all forms of his career. And he did continue to work on music. I mean, he wrote songs, he wrote poems, he continued to play the trumpet. The trumpet still exists. The trumpet is
Oh.
still alive and well. Yeah, the trumpet is alive and well. And I've even got some audio recordings of never before heard audio recordings of Spike and his band playing.
Oh wow.
Yeah, back in the day, in the war era, he's kept these old recordings that I've got access through the family and through Spike Milligan
That's
Productions. So there's a
amazing.
lot of material going into the show that is a world first. When Norma died and the old office was cleared,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so much material was discovered that had been filed away and kept safe. And the family are only now getting to go through it all to work out what things are.
That's
So
so exciting.
to have that kind of insight into him is another reason why I think he would make a great dinner guest, because I think that there's a lot of stuff that I'd like to go, what did you mean by that? Or, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
and
What do
I
you think
often
he would
think,
make of the stage productions?
well, I don't know. I mean, I hope he loved them. Seeley, who came to see the show, Seeley's his youngest of the, second, the middle daughter.
Yeah.
And Seeley did get to see Cocoon in Leicester Square, actually, where you saw it. And she said to me, Dad would have loved this. And it's better than the book. And I said, "Well, God's sake, don't say that. I don't want that on the poster. That's quite the thing." And then Jane had been on tour because Jane's an actress, so she had been on
Yeah.
tour when we did it in Leicester Square. But when we did it again for the final tour, we finished somewhere in Dublin, and Jane flew over to see it, and
Oh, lovely.
she loved it. She just said Dad would have been absolutely thrilled with that, and that's all I needed to hear,
Yeah, you
because
can't
it's
really get a higher
uh, you
compliment
know,
than
I'm
that,
never
can
going to
you?
know whether J.M. Barrie enjoyed Peter Pan. I don't think he would, because he didn't. it wasn't his show. I don't know so many writers that whose material I've worked on. I would never know that, but to know that something I've written, and he did see me in a show once. This is my little claim
Oh,
to fame. I was doing a musical with Jane. She was my girlfriend in this musical in Basingstoke, I think, about 1998.
right.
And I had a funny bit to do where the director came up with this idea that my character was trying to woo one of the girls, and I was going to do it by doing some sexy dancing. So the music, the live band is playing, and I was doing sexy dance, but of course it was funny dancing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the audience is roaring with laughter, and I suddenly remember Spike is in, and so I did a bit of Irish dancing, just apropos nothing. So in the middle of this nightclub in 1960s Manchester, where we're meant to be dancing to Motown and Tamla hits,
Yeah.
this strange little Mancunian man that I was playing suddenly did some Irish dancing to win the girl, and I saw Spike's head go back, and I thought, well, I've either killed him or he's found that funny, and thankfully he found it funny. And Jane
Oh,
said
wow.
to him afterwards, and this is how cantankerous he could be. She said, this was after the dirty arm comment, and
Yeah.
she said, well, Paul was the musical director, which I also was, musical director, and this was what we call now jukebox show. It was lots of famous Motown hits.
Hmm.
And Spike just looked at me and went, "Who wrote that bloody awful music?" Knowing full well that it was jukebox. And I've used that quote actually on a number of my posters ever since. So if I've got a new show opening, I always like to slip in somewhere in the book, the who wrote that bloody awful music, Spike Milligan, as a comment on my work.
Oh, wow. You're so lucky to have met him, and yeah, how special to have his family kind of confirm that about the shows that you've been involved with, that you would have enjoyed them. I mean, all of your guests so far, even J.M. Barrie, who maybe sounds like he would have been a bit difficult, I think with Sue Pollard there, she'd do a job at bringing him out of his shell. Arthur Sullivan on the piano, Jim Henson just being lovely, and Spike. That is the makings of an extraordinary night.
It
The
is, and if
only
you think
thing,
about it, I'm just looking at the list now and thinking, of course, J.M. Barrie and Arthur Sullivan would know each other because they were around at the same time, and there
oh
is evidence that they
yeah,
had dinner a few times. Jim Henson and Spike Milligan knew each other because Spike did the Muppets,
of course,
and
yeah.
at least one variety performance. So actually, and Sue, I'm sure I don't know which of them Sue knew. She's not old enough to have known Arthur Sullivan or J.M. Barrie, but she might well have known Henson, and I'm almost sure she at least met Spike more than a few times. So there is some conversation, as you can see, already happening there.
And what's interesting about that is it goes back to that sort of philosophy you have with your casts as well. Back to what you were saying while we were talking about Jim, that it's nice to have a group that kind of are already friendly and close, and that kind of carries over into the work. I think you've already
Oh,
got the makings of a very familiar
well,
and cozy dinner
I've done that
party.
subconsciously, so that's good.
That's how good you've gotten at doing it, Paul.
It's subliminal.
Well, the only thing left to decide now is what you would be cooking for your guests. So
Well,
first of
I
all,
did.
you mentioned earlier you don't do small dishes, so
No.
there'd be plenty there for people. Uh, you've got some dietary requirements. You're gluten intolerant, is that
Yes, I'm
correct?
celiac, so
Yeah.
everything there would be gluten free, but I do pride myself in nobody ever knowing that. And I also, yes, I'm also, the past couple of years been dairy intolerant. So
Oh, right.
there won't be a cheese board because vegan cheese is nobody's friend. Um, and believe me, I've tried everything, but I would be providing actual dairy products for my guests. I'd subject them to gluten free because nobody knows, but I think that
Yeah,
I would be including dairy in the guest for my food for my guests.
that's very good of you. So what would you be throwing together for them?
I think actually looking at them and knowing that the party's in the garden, I think we would do a big grill out. I think we'd do a big
Oh,
barbecue
lovely.
grill out. Apart from anything else, the idea of J.M. Barrie tackling a sweet and sour pork rib and getting it all over and Sir Arthur Sullivan with a hot dog and stuff. All of this appeals to me. I would do some vegan stuff. because Spike occasionally was certainly vegetarian.
Yeah.
Don't know about the others. Sue eats little and often, so I would do lots of smaller sausages and bits of chicken and things like that. But basically, imagine a Toby Carvery sort of a harvester salad bar, and then a grill out that has bits of certainly some fish. I love fish. There's some fish and different kinds of meats and sausages and chicken and things like that. And then it is a kind of, what can I get you? And also
Yeah.
get up and help yourselves. It's very much that kind of affair.
Oh, it sounds just
I want this to
perfect.
happen now. So tell me, how are you going to make this happen? Because I believe that's part of the
This is
deal.
the guilt that I'm left with at the end of every episode. Everybody's already just described the most perfect night of their lives. And then I sort of have to finish it by saying, oh, well, it was nice to have thought about it at
So I'm
least.
going to go now and have a cup of tea and walk the dog. And this party is never happening.
Well, I hope even just talking about it at least was filled some of the gap of it not actually happening.
It has. I
Uh,
feel I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been to this party.
yeah. I mean, I just love hearing from people about the people that inspire them most, and your guests are just so fascinating. Um, and knowing you as I do as well, it's sort of extra lovely for me to. I feel like I've gotten to know you a little bit better, even talking about
Good.
these people now. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been so lovely talking to you.
You're very welcome.
And yeah, I hope to see you when all this nastiness goes away. I hope to see you and some of your lovely productions in lovely theatres full of packed, happy audiences very soon.
That would indeed be lovely. And we will do a garden party. I know from that list of five, there's at least one I can get there. So
Yes,
we'll have that and 4 cardboard cutouts. That's what we'll try and do.
that sounds like a great plan. Paul, thank you, and we'll speak again soon.
Speak soon.
Cheers, bye bye. So there we go. That was the dream dinner party of Paul Boyd. A really fascinating group of guests there. I'm having so much fun chatting to people every week about the people that inspire them most. I hope you're enjoying it too. If you are, we'd really love it if you'd like, subscribe, rate, share, tweet about, shout about, just generally help us get the word out about the podcast. We'd love to reach as wide an audience with the podcast as possible, and you can really help us out with doing that. If you want to hear any more from me, you can check out the Jericho Comedy Podcast out every Monday, or visit www.conormcreynolds.com for more of my radio, podcast, writing, and comedy work. I'll be back next week with another brilliant guest chatting all about their dream dinner party, but until then, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you again. Bye bye.